The Soviet Union had 40,000 nuclear warheads, controlled half of Europe, and commanded the second-largest economy on Earth. It disappeared in 731 days, not conquered, not invaded. It simply ceased to exist while the world watched in disbelief. Most people blame Gorbachev or Reagan or the Afghan War. They're looking at symptoms, not the disease. This isn't a story about politics or ideology. This is a pattern recognition exercise, a systems analysis of how superpowers die. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee what's happening right now. Let me show you where it started. Nikolai Ryzhkov was the premier of the Soviet Union, the second most powerful man in a superpower of 290 million people. In January 1989, he sat in his office inside the Kremlin reviewing economic reports that would never be published. The official statistics showed steady growth. The real numbers showed something else entirely. Soviet oil production had peaked. Hard currency reserves were evaporating. The Afghan war was bleeding $5 billion annually into the mountains. Ryzhkov later admitted he knew the system was dying. But when he looked out his window at the red flags flying over Moscow, at the soldiers marching in perfect formation at the empire that had defeated Hitler and conquered space, he could not imagine it ending. Not in his lifetime. Certainly not in 7 or 31 days. Here's the question nobody asked in 1989. How does a 72-year-old superpower with the largest nuclear arsenal in human history collapse faster than a small business goes bankrupt? Tatyana Maltseva still remembers the exact moment she understood. She was 34 years old, a senior engineer at a state electronics factory in Leningrad, earning 280 rubles per month, a respectable Soviet salary. It was November 1989, and she had walked into a grocery store after her shift, the same store she had visited every week for 15 years. The shelves were empty. Not low on stock. Empty. A single jar of pickled cabbage sat alone under the fluorescent lights, and 12 people stood in line to buy it. Tatyana did not buy the cabbage. She walked home in silence, and that night she told her husband they needed to start hiding money. Not saving. Hiding. She converted half their savings, 400 rubles, into American dollars on the black market, paying nearly triple the official exchange rate. Her husband called her paranoid. 2 years later, when the ruble collapsed, those hidden dollars were the only reason they survived. Picture a map of the Soviet Union in early 1989, that vast red expanse stretching across 11 time zones from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Now picture tiny cracks appearing at the edges, invisible at first hairline fractures in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Nobody in Moscow was watching the edges. They were watching the center. What most people get wrong about the Soviet collapse is the timeline. They imagine a slow decline, decades of gradual weakening, visible warning signs that any reasonable observer could identify. The reality is the opposite. The Soviet Union looked stronger in 1988 than it had in years. Oil prices had stabilized. Gorbachev was a global celebrity winning peace prizes, charming Western leaders. The military was intact. The KGB was functioning. Every metric that outsiders used to measure Soviet power suggested stability. The collapse was invisible until it wasn't, and then it was unstoppable. Viktor Kozlov was a colonel in the Soviet Army, 47 years old, stationed in East Germany with the Western Group of Forces. He commanded a tank battalion, 62 T-80 tanks, 400 soldiers, enough firepower to punch through NATO's front lines in hours. In September 1989, his unit was one of 380,000 Soviet troops occupying East Germany, the iron fist that kept the Eastern Bloc in line. Viktor had dedicated 26 years to the Red Army. He had a wife in Moscow, a daughter in university, a pension that would provide for them until death. By 1992, Viktor was selling cigarettes on a street corner in Volgograd. His pension was worthless. His tanks belonged to a country that no longer existed. His 26 years of service had purchased exactly nothing. Now, here's the second question nobody wanted to answer. If the CIA, with all its satellites and spies and billion-dollar budgets, could not see the collapse coming, how would ordinary citizens have any chance? The answer is, they wouldn't. And that's precisely the point. Yelena Baranova saw it differently. She was 29, an accountant at a state textile ministry in Moscow, and she had access to numbers that never appeared in Pravda. She noticed that the ministry was paying suppliers in IOUs instead of rubles. She noticed that factories were trading products directly with each other because the banking system couldn't process payments fast enough. She noticed that her own salary was arriving later and later each month. In March 1990, Yelena quietly resigned from her government job and took a position with a Finnish trading company operating in Moscow. Her colleagues thought she was insane, leaving a secure state position for a foreign employer. Her salary doubled. When the collapse came, she had hard currency savings and an employer that still existed. Yelena was not smarter than Victor. She simply trusted the system less. Empires do not collapse from weakness. They collapse from the gap between their perceived strength and their actual strength. The wider the gap, the faster the fall. The Soviet gap in 1989 was a chasm. The official economy showed growth while the real economy contracted. The official military showed power while the Afghan war exposed decay. The official ideology proclaimed victory while citizens stood in breadlines. Every institution was performing a role in a play that everyone knew was fiction, but nobody could afford to stop acting. There is a name for this moment when everyone privately knows the system is broken, but publicly pretends it is strong. Sociologists call it pluralistic ignorance. Historians call it the final phase. Imagine the view from space, the Soviet Union, as a massive glacier, seemingly permanent, ancient, immovable. But beneath the surface, warm currents are hollowing out the ice. The structure looks solid. The structure is hollow. And when it finally cracks, it does not crack slowly. It shatters. That shattering began on November 9, 1989, with an event that shocked the world. But to understand why a wall falling in Berlin could unravel an empire stretching to Vladivostok, we need to follow the money. And the money leads somewhere that American viewers should find uncomfortably familiar. The Soviet economy ran on a simple principle that sounds logical until you examine it closely. The state owned everything, the state planned everything, and the state decided what everything was worth. A factory in Novosibirsk did not set its own prices. A committee in Moscow set them. A farmer in Ukraine did not choose what to grow. A directive from the Kremlin chose for him. This eliminated competition, eliminated profit motive, eliminated market signals. It also eliminated the one thing every economy needs to survive: accurate information about what things actually cost. Think of it like a household budget, where you're not allowed to check your bank account. You guess how much money you have. You guess what things cost. You make decisions based on those guesses. Now imagine running that household for 70 years. Alexei Volkov was a factory manager in Chelyabinsk, 41 years old, responsible for producing ball bearings for the Soviet military. In 1985, his factory received a production quota of 2.4 million bearings per year. The quota came from Moscow. The raw materials came from a steel plant in Magnitogorsk, allocated by Moscow. The price he could charge was set by Moscow. Alexei's job was not to run a profitable business. His job was to hit the quota. So he hit the quota. He hit it by cutting corners, by using lower-grade steel, by skipping quality inspections. The bearings looked identical. They failed 3 times faster than Western equivalents. But nobody in Moscow knew that, because nobody in Moscow could know that. The system was designed to produce numbers, not information. Here is what most people get wrong about the Soviet economy. They imagine it failed because socialism doesn't work. That's ideology, not analysis. The Soviet economy failed because it was blind. It could not see itself. When oil prices collapsed in 1986, dropping from $30 per barrel to $10, the entire system should have adjusted. Spending should have decreased. Priorities should have shifted. But the system had no mechanism to adjust because the system had no mechanism to see. Moscow kept issuing the same quotas, kept printing the same rubles, kept pretending the numbers were real. Remember Tatyana Maltseva from Leningrad, the engineer who hid 300-400 rubles in dollars. She worked at a factory that produced television sets. In 1987, her factory received components from 14 different suppliers across 6 Soviet republics. If any single supplier missed a delivery, her factory stopped. There was no alternative supplier. There was no market to find one. The entire economy was a chain, and every link depended on every other link. When the chain started breaking, it broke everywhere at once. Now picture a different map, not geography, but money flow. Rubles moving from Moscow outward like blood from a heart. But the blood is contaminated. Every year, the Soviet government printed more rubles to cover the gap between what it spent and what it collected. In 1985, that gap was 18 billion rubles. By 1989, it was 92 billion. The money supply was expanding, while the goods supply was stagnating. Basic economics dictates what happens next, but Soviet economics pretended it wouldn't. So why didn't prices rise? Why didn't inflation become visible? Because the state controlled prices. A loaf of bread cost the same in 1989 as it did in 1979. Officially. But unofficially, that bread was simply not available. The inflation was hidden in empty shelves in 4-hour lines in black markets where the real prices emerged. By 1990, the black market exchange rate for dollars was 8 times the official rate. 2 economies existed simultaneously: the official economy of stable prices and guaranteed employment, and the real economy of scarcity and hidden desperation. Pavel Orlov was a mid-level bureaucrat in the State Planning Committee, Gosplan, one of the 1,600 officials who literally planned the Soviet economy. He was 38 years old, and his specific responsibility was coordinating grain distribution across the Russian Republic. In late 1989, Pavel received reports that grain shipments were arriving at rail depots, but not being loaded onto trains. Workers were demanding payment in goods instead of rubles. The rubles were becoming worthless in the countryside because there was nothing to buy with them. Pavel wrote a memo warning that the distribution system was breaking down. His supervisor rewrote the memo to show that distribution was proceeding normally. That was how information flowed in the Soviet system upward through filters that removed any inconvenient truth. Here's a question that matters more than it seems. Who was counting the money? In a market economy, millions of independent actors count the money banks: businesses, investors, consumers. Each one has an incentive to count accurately because their survival depends on it. In the Soviet economy, one institution counted the money, the state, and the state had an incentive to count inaccurately because accurate counting would reveal the collapse. The mechanism that destroyed the Soviet Union was not communism. The mechanism was informational blindness combined with mounting debt. The state could not see the real condition of the economy. The state kept spending as if the economy were healthy. The gap between reality and perception widened until the structure could no longer hold. Irina Fedorova was a schoolteacher in Kiev, 33 years old, married to a factory supervisor. In 1988, her household was comfortable by Soviet standards: 2 incomes, a small apartment, a Lada automobile purchased after 7 years on a waiting list. By 1990, her husband's factory had stopped paying wages in rubles. Instead, workers received vouchers redeemable only at the factory store, which stocked whatever products the factory could obtain through barter. Irina's savings, carefully accumulated over a decade, remained in her state bank account. The numbers did not change, but the purchasing power disappeared so gradually that she did not notice until it was too late. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that account held 200 rubles, enough to buy a winter coat in 1988, enough to buy 2 loaves of bread in 1992. There is a moment in every collapse when the official story and the lived reality diverge so completely that ordinary people must choose which one to believe. The Soviet citizens who chose to believe the official story lost everything. The ones who trusted their own eyes, like Tatiana, with her hidden dollars, like Yelena, who took the Finnish job, those were the ones who survived. But here is the unexpected part. The Soviet leadership knew. Not all of them, but enough. Internal reports from the KGB in 1989 warned of economic instability. Gorbachev's own advisors told him the system was unsustainable. They knew the debt was mounting. They knew the currency was dying. They knew the republics were restless. And they did nothing that could fix it, because fixing it required admitting it was broken. And admitting it was broken would shatter the legitimacy that held the empire together. So they printed more rubles. They issued more quotas. They gave more speeches about socialist triumph. They performed stability while the foundation crumbled beneath them. The parallel to the present should be becoming clear. But before we draw that parallel explicitly, we need to understand what happened when the performance finally ended. We need to see how fast the collapse actually moved once it started moving. Because the speed is the part that nobody believes until they see the evidence. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. What happened next took exactly 731 days. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, and the world celebrated. Television cameras captured Germans dancing on the concrete, spraying champagne, embracing strangers. Western leaders declared victory. The Cold War was over. Freedom had won. What nobody understood, what nobody could understand at the time, was that they were watching the first domino fall in a sequence that would destroy a superpower in exactly 731 days. Here is what most people get wrong about the Soviet collapse. They think the Berlin Wall was the cause. It was not the cause. It was the symptom. The wall fell because the Soviet Union could no longer afford to prop it up. And once the world saw that the empire could not hold its edges, everyone started doing the math on what else it could not hold. Gennady Burbulis was a philosopher-turned-politician from Sverdlovsk, 44 years old, and in December 1989, he was watching the Baltic republics with careful attention. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. The three small nations on the Soviet Union's western edge had begun demanding independence. The official Soviet response was dismissal. These were tiny territories, 8 million people combined, barely a footnote, in an empire of 290 million. Moscow would never let them go. But Burbulis noticed something the official response missed. The Baltic republics were testing whether the empire would use force, and the empire hesitated. Picture the map again, that vast red expanse from Berlin to Vladivostok. Now imagine a crack appearing in the northwest corner, a hairline fracture, invisible from Moscow, fatal in hindsight. On March 11, 1990, Lithuania declared independence. It was the first Soviet republic to do so. Moscow declared the act illegal. Moscow imposed an economic blockade. Moscow threatened military intervention. And then Moscow did nothing. The Soviet army had 500,000 troops in Eastern Europe alone. It had crushed Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968 without hesitation. But in 1990, the empire that had never flinched was suddenly paralyzed. Anatoly Sobchak was the mayor of Leningrad, a reformer, a lawyer. And in private conversations, he explained exactly why Moscow hesitated. The Soviet government was broke. A military operation in Lithuania would cost billions of rubles the treasury did not have. It would trigger Western sanctions on a government already dependent on Western grain imports. It would accelerate the very collapse it was meant to prevent. The empire was trapped. It could not afford to hold together, and it could not afford to let go. Remember Colonel Viktor Kozlov commanding his tank battalion in East Germany. In early 1990, his unit received orders to prepare for withdrawal. Not redeployment. Withdrawal. The 380,000 Soviet troops in East Germany, the iron fist that had held Europe divided for 45 years, were being sent home. Victor understood military logistics. He understood that withdrawing an army of this size would take years and cost billions. He also understood something his commanders did not say aloud. There was nowhere to put these soldiers when they returned. No housing, no jobs, no plan. The empire was dismantling its own military because it could not afford to maintain it. So why didn't the Soviet leadership tell the truth? Why didn't they admit the system was failing and attempt a managed transition? The answer reveals the central tragedy of every collapsing empire. The truth would have accelerated the collapse. Admitting insolvency would have triggered a bank run on the ruble. Admitting military weakness would have emboldened every republic seeking independence. Admitting economic failure would have shattered the Communist Party's claim to legitimacy. The leadership was trapped in a performance they could not exit. They had to keep pretending until the stage collapsed beneath them. Let me show you what the performance looked like from inside. Valentin Pavlov was the finance minister of the Soviet Union in 1990, the man responsible for managing an economy in freefall. In January 1991, Pavlov executed one of the most desperate monetary maneuvers in modern history. Without warning, he announced that all 50 and 100 ruble banknotes, the largest denominations, were invalid. Citizens had 3 days to exchange them at banks. The limit was 1,000 rubles per person. Anyone holding more than 1,000 rubles in large bills simply lost the excess. The official justification was fighting corruption and black markets. The real reason was that the government had printed so many rubles that it needed to erase some of them from existence. Imagine waking up tomorrow and being told that every $100 bill you own is worthless unless you can exchange it within 72 hours and you can only exchange 10 of them. Nadezhda Petrova was a retired school teacher in Minsk, 67 years old, living on a pension of 120 rubles per month. She had saved 600 rubles over 30 years, her entire life surplus kept in a drawer, because she did not trust banks. When Pavlov's decree came, she walked to the local savings bank to exchange her 50 and 100 ruble notes. The line stretched around the block. She waited 9 hours. When she reached the counter, she was told the limit was 1,000 rubles. The remaining 600 rubles, 30 years of careful saving, 30 years of small sacrifices became worthless paper. Nadezhda walked home and did not speak for 3 days. Her granddaughter later said she never recovered. She died in 1993, and the family believes the shock of that loss shortened her life. Now, here is the part that should make your blood cold. While Nadezhda was losing her life savings in a bank line, the Communist Party elites were converting their rubles into dollars through special channels that ordinary citizens could not access. While factory workers watched their wages become worthless, party officials were transferring state assets into private accounts in Western banks. The same leaders who created the crisis were positioning themselves to profit from the collapse. When the Soviet Union finally died, many of those officials emerged as the oligarchs of the new Russia. Billionaires built on the ashes of a system they had helped destroy. Pause for a moment and consider what this means. The people who ran the system knew it was dying. They did not warn the citizens. They did not attempt an orderly transition. They looted what remained and let ordinary people absorb the devastation. Remember Pavel Orlov, the Gosplan bureaucrat, whose memo about grain distribution was rewritten to hide the truth. By 1991, Pavel had stopped writing memos entirely. He understood that accurate information was not wanted. He also understood that the collapse was now inevitable. In August 1991, Pavel was in Moscow when a group of hardline communist officials attempted a coup against Gorbachev. Tanks rolled through the streets. The world held its breath. The coup failed within 3 days, not because of popular resistance, but because even the plotters did not believe in the system they were trying to save. The military refused to fire on civilians. The KGB refused to arrest opposition leaders. The institutions of Soviet power had become hollow shells, performing functions that no longer mattered. The coup's failure broke something that could not be repaired. If the center could not even execute a successful power grab, the center was finished. What followed was not a collapse. It was an evaporation. Ukraine declared independence on August 24th. Belarus on August 25th. Moldova, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. One by one, the republics severed themselves from an empire that could no longer compel their loyalty. By December 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that had already ceased to exist. The next day, December 26th, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin at 7:32 p.m. Moscow time. The hammer and sickle came down. The Russian tricolor went up, and 290 million people woke up the next morning as citizens of countries that had not existed the day before. 731 days. From the fall of the Berlin Wall to the end of the Soviet Union. Not decades, not generations. 731 days. Empires do not die in slow motion. They die in fast forward once the dying starts. Remember Tatyana Maltseva, the engineer who converted half her savings to dollars on the black market, while her husband called her paranoid. By December 1991, those dollars were worth 60 times their original ruble equivalent. Tatyana was not a genius. She was not an insider. She simply trusted the evidence of her eyes more than the promises of her government. She prepared while others hoped. And when the collapse came, she had something left. Viktor Kozlov had nothing left. His pension, his rank, his 26 years of service, worthless. The empire he had defended no longer existed. The army he had served was being dismantled. He was 49 years old, trained for a world that had vanished, and the new world had no place for him. Two people, two outcomes, the same collapse. Now we need to understand what came after, because the collapse was not the end of the suffering. The collapse was the beginning. The Soviet flag came down on December 26, 1991. Most Western observers assumed the worst was over. The empire had fallen. Democracy would rise. Markets would flourish. The transition would be difficult but manageable. They were catastrophically wrong. The collapse was not the end of the crisis. The collapse was the beginning of a decade-long disintegration that would kill millions of people and erase the wealth of an entire generation. Between 1991 and 1994, Russian GDP fell by 40%. Not a recession, not a depression. A destruction of nearly half the economy in 3 years. Life expectancy for Russian men dropped from 64 years to 57 years, a peacetime decline unprecedented in any industrialized nation. Alcoholism, suicide, cardiovascular disease, violence. The stress of collapse was killing people faster than any war. By some demographic estimates, the Soviet collapse caused between 3 and 7 million excess deaths across the former republics during the 1990s. These were not battlefield casualties. These were accountants, teachers, engineers, factory workers, pensioners, people whose lives simply broke under the weight of a vanished system. Viktor Kozlov, the tank commander who ended up selling cigarettes on a street corner, did not survive the decade. He died in 1998 at 56 years old from heart failure. His daughter later said that he died of humiliation. A man who had commanded 62 tanks, who had been trusted with nuclear weapons protocols, who had served his country for 26 years, reduced to poverty in a country that no longer remembered his service. Victor's pension, when it arrived at all, was worth less than the cost of the cigarettes he sold. His military housing was seized. His medals became worthless decorations. He drank more each year. His heart gave out. What most people get wrong about economic collapse is the timeline of suffering. They imagine a sharp crisis followed by recovery. The reality is the opposite. The initial shock is survivable. The years that follow are not. Savings that seemed adequate in year 1 are exhausted by year 3. Skills that seemed transferable become obsolete. Networks that seemed reliable disappear. The collapse does not kill you immediately. It kills you slowly over years as every safety net frays and every backup plan fails. Picture a graph showing Russian real wages from 1991 to 1999. The line does not drop once and recover. It drops, stabilizes, briefly, drops, again, stabilizes, drops again. By 1998, real wages were 40% of their 1991 level. People who thought they had weathered the storm in 1992 discovered they were still falling in 1997. But not everyone fell. And understanding who rose while others drowned reveals the mechanism of every collapse. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was 30 years old when the Soviet Union ended. He had been a minor Communist Party official running a youth organization that manufactured and sold computers. When the state began selling off its assets in the early 1990s, the infamous loans for shares privatization, Khodorkovsky was positioned to buy. He acquired Yukos Oil Company, one of the largest oil producers in Russia, for approximately $300 million. Within a decade, Yukos was worth $30 billion. Khodorkovsky became one of the richest men in the world. The same collapse that killed Viktor Kozlov made Mikhail Khodorkovsky a billionaire. Here is the question that defines every collapse: who had access to information and who had access to capital? The people who knew the system was dying. The party officials, the KGB officers, the industrial managers, they had time to position themselves. They converted rubles to dollars. They identified which state assets would be sold and arranged to purchase them. They built relationships with Western banks and investors. By the time ordinary citizens understood what was happening, the valuable pieces of the Soviet economy had already been claimed. Yelena Baranova, the accountant who took the finished job in 1990, watched this process from inside. Her employer was one of the first Western companies to operate in Moscow, and she saw the deals being made. She saw state factories worth billions sold for millions. She saw party officials become corporate executives overnight. She saw the legal frameworks being written to legitimize transfers that would have been called theft in any other context. By 1995, Yelena had saved $40,000 in hard currency, a fortune by Russian standards. She used it to buy a small apartment in Moscow when real estate prices collapsed. By 2005, that apartment was worth $400,000. By 2015, over $1 million. Yelena did not start wealthy. She started observant. She watched the mechanisms of collapse and positioned herself accordingly. Now consider the contrast across borders. Poland also transitioned from communism in 1989. Poland also faced economic chaos, inflation, unemployment. But Poland's trajectory diverged sharply from Russia's. By 2000, Polish GDP had recovered to pre-transition levels and was growing steadily. By 2020, Polish GDP per capita had increased fivefold from 1990 levels. The same historical moment produced devastation in Russia and growth in Poland. Why the mechanisms were different. Poland implemented rapid reforms with Western support and integration into European institutions. Russia's reforms were captured by insiders who designed them for extraction rather than development. Poland's collapse was managed. Russia's collapse was looted. But here is the uncomfortable truth that matters for American viewers. The difference between Poland and Russia was not culture or character. The difference was who controlled the transition. When elites manage a collapse for their own benefit, the population suffers for decades. When institutions force accountability, recovery is possible. Remember Nadezhda Petrova, the retired teacher who lost 3,600 rubles in the currency exchange of 1991. She died in 1993, but her granddaughter Katya was 16 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Katya watched her grandmother broken by the loss. She watched her parents' savings evaporate. She watched her father, an engineer, take 3 jobs to afford food. Katya drew one conclusion from this experience: never trust the system. She learned English. She learned accounting. She saved in dollars. In 2003, she emigrated to Canada. Today, Katya is a financial controller at a manufacturing company in Toronto, earning $120,000 per year with a pension plan, a house, and citizenship in a stable country. The granddaughter of a woman destroyed by collapse rebuilt her life by leaving. The ones who stayed, who trusted, who waited for the system to recover, many of them are still waiting. What does a generation of collapse look like from the inside? Imagine being 25 years old in Moscow in 1991 with a university degree in engineering, a promising career, a new marriage, a sense that life was beginning. Now imagine that by 35, your savings are gone, your factory has closed, your marriage has broken under financial stress, and you are working 3 informal jobs to afford rent. By 45, you have rebuilt something, a small business, a stable job, but you have no pension, no security, no buffer. By 55, your health is failing from decades of stress, and you realize that you will work until you die because there is no alternative. This is not a hypothetical. This is the lived experience of millions of people across the former Soviet Union. The collapse did not end. It became permanent for an entire generation. And the wealth that generation lost did not disappear. It concentrated. By 2000, a small group of oligarchs controlled over 50% of Russia's economy. The assets that had belonged to 290 million Soviet citizens were now owned by perhaps 100 families. This was not an accident. This was the mechanism. Collapse is not destruction of wealth. Collapse is transfer of wealth from the many who trusted the system to the few who understood it was ending. There is a timeline that American viewers should find disturbing. The Soviet Union's breaking point was 1986. The visible collapse began in 1989. The complete dissolution occurred in 1991. The consequences continued for 15 years. America's breaking point by the same structural analysis was 2008. The visible cracks are appearing now. If the pattern holds, the cascade phase is imminent, and the consequences will extend to 2035 and beyond. But that comparison requires careful examination, because while the patterns are identical, the mechanisms have evolved, and what is happening to American power right now is both familiar and unprecedented. Let me bring you back to where we started. Red Square, Moscow, January 1st, 1989. A Soviet citizen standing beneath the hammer and sickle, absolutely certain that the system is eternal. Now replace that image. Washington, D.C., January 2025. An American citizen standing beneath the stars and stripes, absolutely certain that the system is permanent. The parallels are not metaphorical. They are structural. The Soviet Union in 1989 had military bases across the globe it could no longer afford to maintain. The United States in 2025 has 800 bases in 80 countries funded by debt that compounds faster than the economy grows. The Soviet Union was printing rubles to cover deficits while pretending the currency was stable. The United States has printed $8 trillion since 2020, while the Federal Reserve insists inflation is under control. The Soviet republics were quietly building alternative arrangements, hedging against the center's weakness. American allies are quietly conducting trade in yuan and rupees, in currencies that do not depend on Washington's approval. Picture a chart showing the dollar's share of global central bank reserves. In 2001, the line sits at 73%. By 2015, it has declined to 66%. By 2025, it hovers near 58%. The line is not volatile. It is steady, consistent, predictable in its direction. This is not a crisis. This is a trajectory. Here is what most people get wrong about the current moment. They look for a single catastrophic event, a war, a crash, a default that will mark the end. But the Soviet collapse teaches a different lesson. The end is a process, not an event. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, the collapse had already been underway for years. The wall was simply the moment when the invisible became visible. James Chen is a treasury bond analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Chicago. He is 41 years old, and for the past 3 years, he has watched something that troubles him deeply. Foreign central banks are reducing their holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. Not dramatically, the kind of steady, quiet reduction that does not make headlines. Japan, once the largest foreign holder, has sold over $200 billion in treasuries since 2022. China has reduced its holdings by a similar amount. The buyers who once absorbed American debt automatically are stepping back. James does not know what this means, but he knows it means something. Remember Tatyana Maltseva, the Leningrad engineer, who converted her rubles to dollars while her husband called her paranoid. She survived the collapse because she trusted her observations more than official assurances. She did not predict the exact date of the Soviet dissolution. She did not need to. She simply noticed that the system was behaving in ways that contradicted its stated stability, and she acted on that observation. What observations are available today? The U.S. national debt has crossed $36 trillion. The annual deficit exceeds $2 trillion with no political pathway to reduction. Interest payments on the debt now exceed the entire defense budget. The Federal Reserve has stated it cannot raise interest rates to appropriate levels without triggering a financial crisis and cannot lower them without reigniting inflation. These are not conspiracy theories. These are published figures from the Congressional Budget Office and Federal Reserve statements. Maria Santos is a high school economics teacher in Phoenix, Arizona. She is 38 years old, and she recently redesigned her curriculum to include a unit on currency crises. Her students are skeptical. They cannot imagine the dollar failing. It has been the world's reserve currency their entire lives. Maria shows them the same progression she learned in graduate school. The British pound was the global reserve currency for over a century before the dollar replaced it. The transition took about 30 years. It was invisible to most people while it was happening. There is a framework for understanding these transitions, and it is not complicated. Ask 3 questions. First, is the debt growing faster than the economy? If yes, the math eventually becomes impossible. Second, are other nations building alternatives to the current system? If yes, the exit routes are being constructed. Third, are the people managing the system acknowledging the problem or performing stability? If they are performing, the gap between perception and reality is widening. These questions do not predict timing, they identify trajectory. Let me revisit one more person from our story. Yelena Baranova, the accountant who left her government job for a Finnish company in 1990. Her colleagues thought she was insane. She was not insane. She was paying attention to systems rather than statements. She noticed that her ministry was paying suppliers in IOUs. She noticed that her salary was arriving later each month. She noticed that the gap between official reality and lived reality was growing. Yelena did not have inside information. She had pattern recognition. Today, Yelena is 73 years old, living in Helsinki. She became a Finnish citizen in 2004. Her retirement is secure. Her grandchildren attend Finnish schools. When asked about the Soviet collapse, she says the same thing every time: the people who survived were the people who believed their eyes instead of their newspapers. Now here is the contrarian point that complicates everything. The United States is not the Soviet Union. The American economy, despite its problems, is more dynamic, more innovative, more adaptable than the Soviet command system ever was. American institutions, despite their dysfunction, still contain mechanisms for reform that the USSR lacked entirely. The dollar's reserve status, even in decline, remains dominant in ways the ruble never was. These differences matter. They may mean that America's trajectory leads to managed decline rather than sudden collapse. They may mean that the timeline extends to 2040 rather than 2029. They may mean that the pattern breaks entirely. But here is the part that should prevent complacency. Every citizen of a collapsing empire believes their empire is the exception. The British believed it in 1945. The Soviets believed it in 1989. The belief does not prevent the collapse. It merely ensures that the population is unprepared when it arrives. This video is not a prediction. Systems this complex do not yield to prediction. This video is pattern recognition. The pattern shows military overextension debt that cannot be serviced. Currency, losing reserve status. Allies building alternatives. Leadership performing stability while foundations crack. The pattern was present in the Soviet Union. The pattern is present today. The question is not whether you believe America will collapse. Belief is irrelevant. The question is whether you are positioned for possibility, whether your skills, your savings, your networks, your understanding, whether these depend entirely on the current system continuing unchanged, or whether they retain value across different scenarios. Remember the final image, the Soviet flag descending from the Kremlin at 7:32 p.m. on December 26, 1991. The citizens watching did not believe it was possible until it happened, and then it was too late to prepare. The lesson of history is not that collapse is inevitable. The lesson is that collapse is invisible until it becomes unstoppable. The Soviet citizens who survived were not the ones who predicted the end. They were the ones who prepared for possibility, while others insisted on permanence. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, the rhythm is unmistakable. The 731-day countdown may have already begun. The only question is whether you will recognize it in time.